In this video, we're going to look at the whole GameStop, Wall Street bets, Robinhood scenario that occurred in January there, and we're going to look at what lessons we can learn from a software engineering and architectural perspective. In particular, we're going to look at 3 lessons that we can learn from this saga. The first one is we need to design our software and solutions to scale from a business perspective, not just a technical perspective. The second thing we need to learn is being able to identify black swan events and how to design our software solutions to handle them. And then the third one, which we'll talk about at the end of the video, is how we've moved into this social engineering, social scale world, and that fundamentally changes our business and puts a lot of businesses at risk. And we're going to look at that and understand how we can sort of deal with that. Okay, before we can learn all the lessons from this saga, we actually just need to level set and understand what happened and who all the players were in this saga. So the first player was Gamestop, and for people who don't know what Gamestop is, it is an American video game retailer operating out of stores. It's very similar in the UK to something like Game. Essentially, they sell video games in shops, right? Makes sense. And of course, as a company, they are going through a digital transformation. So they're moving from selling in the physical retail outlets to selling online. And of course, they just got a new CEO who joined the company, who's an expert in online selling and was CEO of a pet food company, I think, before. And that is one of the catalysts of this whole scenario. So this kicked off when he joined the company and a lot of people believing in him. The second player in this scenario is the commercial hedge funds. So these are your institutional investors who didn't really believe in GameStop. So they looked at that and said, actually, kind of retail isn't going to work. Physical retail outlets doesn't work for us. And they were looking at it and saying, well, I don't believe this digital transformation is going to work. So they were betting against a successful online transformation. And what they decided to do was short sell the GameStop stock. So for anyone who doesn't know what short selling is, it's essentially when you borrow a stock and then hope that that stock goes down. So when it goes down, you can then buy the stock at the lower price and then essentially give the stock back to where you borrowed it from and profit the difference in money. All sounds rather simple, except stocks can go up as well as go down. And if the stock goes up, then essentially you're going to have to buy the stock at a higher price than the price you borrowed it at, and therefore you're going to be losing money. And there comes a point where that gets very expensive, and you get this sort of cumulative effect, which is known as a short squeeze, where you keep buying and buying and buying as the stock price goes up as you're trying to realize the differences in loss. And that's essentially what happened in the GameStop scenario, right? These institutional investors bet that the stock was going to go down, but of course the stock went up. So the third and fourth players in this scenario was Reddit and Wall Street Bets. So Reddit is a social news platform and online discussion forum where people can come together, discuss various topics, and they can vote content up and down. And Wall Street Bets is a subreddit or subforum of Reddit where people can come together to talk about stocks and options trading. So essentially think about it as a big discussion forum on Wall Street. Now, if we look at what happened from a Wall Street Bets perspective, a few people on that forum did a lot of technical analysis on the GameStop stock, and they believed that it had value, and they believed that that stock was going to rise, and it was undervalued. And then they started a whole discussion on that, and it encouraged people to get behind that stock and buy that stock. So, and this turned into a huge kind of online movement where people are in it for different reasons. Some people are in it because they think the stock's got a lot of value. Some people want to stick it to the man. But either way, the result of that is a lot of people in this forum were rallied behind GameStop. But not just GameStop, there was a few other stocks like AMC and a few others. But essentially the main player was GameStop, where they were behind this stock and they were trying to drive the price of the stock up and sort of fight against the short selling. And as I explained before, if you've got a short sell going on, the last thing you need is people driving the price up. And of course, there is a sort of fight between the institutional investors and the retail investors, but for the price of the stock, which resulted in lots of people losing money, lots of people making money, but essentially the stock was going in a different direction than the institutional investors were believing it was going to go. And the last player in this scenario was Robinhood. And Robinhood is an app which allows retail investors to buy stock at zero commission. And they do that by being a broker or a middle person in between the retail investors and the market makers. So they're sort of passing orders between the two. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how that works. I'm sure lots of people have different opinions there. But essentially, the Robinhood app is the vehicle for all the people on the Wall Street Bets forum to be able to buy the stocks at zero commission for Gamestop, etc. So this is the scenario, and how that sort of resulted out, as I said, is essentially all of these people on Wall Street Bets started buying the GameStop stock, essentially driving the price up the way, and that sort of went against the short sell that all the institutional investors were doing on GameStop because they believed the stock was going to go down. And lots of people lost lots of money, as I said. So I'm going to keep well away from the controversies of this, right? But what I want to focus on is what the lessons we can learn from a software engineering and architecture perspective. So I think the first lesson that we can learn is all about scaling your application, right? Now, normally as engineers and architects, we focus on scaling applications from a technical perspective. So we look at things like we'll run a performance test, we'll understand the requirements, all our non-functionals, you must run an X number of requests per second, etc., 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 right? But it's all very technically focused. And then when we test that, we will make sure that we're using technologies such as Kubernetes or serverless, and we'll make sure that we can automatically scale our transactions up and down to handle the volume. And we normally have some sort of expected profile of traffic. Now, if you think about what occurred in the Wall Street Bet scenario, and the GameStop scenario, well, kind of Robinhood had designed their application from a technical scaling perspective. So if we think about it, the app didn't fail. The app handled all the transactions that it was needing to handle. The cloud infrastructure didn't fail, right? It was able to handle this mass amount of users coming in from Wall Street Bets and start buying stock. So the cloud infrastructure held out, and the microservices held out as well. So all the backend infrastructure was able to scale up and down to meet the demand. So from a technical scaling perspective, the Robinhood app was meeting that. But where it fell into trouble was from a business scaling perspective. So one of the controversies that occurred is Robinhood stopped allowing customers to buy GameStop and AMC stock on the Robinhood app. Now, the reason they say that they did this is because in order to buy stocks with their brokers, the market makers, they need to put up collateral for the positions the retail investors are taking. So if, for example, you're buying lots and lots and lots of stock, then they need to put up collateral to meet the investments that other people are making, just because stock goes up, down. And what they sort of ran into trouble for from a scaling perspective is they hadn't designed these scenarios to handle this situation where lots of people are buying this one stock, and they had these huge collateral demands, and they struggle from a business scaling perspective. So how they handled this is they restricted people from buying the stock. Now, they still allowed you to sell any other stock. They still allowed you to buy any other stock, but they restricted the buying of the GameStop and AMC stocks. And if you think about it, that's a sort of technique we use in architecture all the time. It's a technique called graceful degradation. So what graceful degradation is, in a software sense, is that if one part of a system is not working, then the rest of the system can continue to work by switching off that one part of the system. So, for example, let's say I've got an e-commerce store and the order history microservice isn't working, but catalog, etc., and cart is still working, then I maybe switch off the order history functionality and the app as a whole can continue to work. And we use that technique quite a lot, especially in scaling, so that if we need to redivert resources, we can switch off elements and sort of focus on the areas we need to support. And if you think about Robinhood's perspective, what they've done there is they use the techniques of graceful degradation, but they've used that from a business perspective. So they're saying, you know what, all my technical services are up and running, but in order to make sure my business continues to keep working, we will allow buying lots of stock in different areas, but we're going to restrict it in this one stock. So they've taken these techniques, but they've applied that from a business perspective, and they've used other techniques such as rate limiting. So after they stopped restricting that things, they then said to somebody, actually, you can buy a couple of these stocks per day, and they had some sort of limits on that. And again, that's a technique called rate limiting. It's a technique we use all the time in software architecture. You will see things like API gateways use rate limiting to ensure that clients are not overloading the system. So that you'll say, you can do X number of API requests per second, or X number of API requests per day, and that's the same sort of technique that Robinhood used from a business perspective. They rate limited the number of stocks that an individual customer could buy after a while. And of course, I'm not going to get into the controversy of this. I'm just looking at this from a kind of software engineering architecture perspective. So they used a lot of those techniques that we would use today from a technical perspective, but they didn't implement the business scaling, right? They didn't think about it from a business perspective. So when everybody started buying these one stocks, they didn't have these processes in place. They never tested out the procedures, and therefore they didn't really know how to do it and how to handle this, and that got them into the scenarios that they got in there. And again, that's something we can learn as software engineers and architects, right? Which is, we always think about technical scaling, but what we need to make sure we do is start designing our solutions with the business in mind and make sure the business have scaling built in, right? And we test the business scaling. In the same ways we test the technical scaling, we need to build in business scaling tests into our overall software development lifecycle to ensure that if somebody is buying one particular stock, or if the business can handle the scale of transactions they're meeting. So the second lesson that we can learn is all about black swans. So what do I mean by that? So if you think about the Robinhood scenario, they weren't expecting everybody to buy at a social engineering scale one stock at once, right? That was not a scenario they had sort of designed for, and therefore that everybody buying the GameStop stock got them into this sort of cycle and this controversy, right? And that's because they had an identified pattern where people are buying stocks across a sort of balanced portfolio across all of these different Wall Street stocks. Now, because everybody started buying this one stock, which was unexpected, that is known as a black swan effect. So if you've never heard of the black swan theory, it's something by So if you've never heard of the black swan theory, it's something by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It's an absolutely brilliant theory, and he's got a couple of books on the subject, and I highly recommend it. But essentially, the theory of black swan events is a major event or major effect occurs which nobody was really expecting. It's a complete surprise, and it's something that's inappropriately rationalized after the event. And that's because of hindsight bias, or that Monday morning quarterback effect, where people go, oh, you should have been able to predict that for whatever reason. But at the time, it wasn't predictable. And really, again, that sums up what happened with GameStop there. Now, What does that mean for us as engineers and architects is we need to test our solutions. We need to test our designs and thinking to ensure that we're handling the black swan effect as our thinking. So we need to start challenging ourselves. What happens if everybody buys one stock at once? What if, we have a social engineer attack and we got way 10 times the amount of traffic than we were expecting? We need to start thinking in that sort of black swan way and identifying those risks and then handle them. And again, one of the techniques you can use is something like a pre-mortem review where you can play out those scenarios and then build in the processes that you're going to put in place to deal with them. But again, the thing to challenge yourself is not just looking at it from a technical perspective, but actually looking at it from a business perspective and a business scaling perspective. So the third thing that we can learn from is this change in the world from a kind of social scale and social engineering perspective. And I think prior to this event, we used to think about things from how do I deal with all of this traffic hitting my site at once or hitting my application at once. But actually what we should be looking at this and saying is, how do we deal with things from a sort of social movement on the internet and how that could potentially affect my business? So anywhere where you are a broker, then you are potentially up for failure from a business perspective. So that is a scenario that any middle person or any broker could get into, especially if there's maybe some sort of credit arrangement between a buyer and a seller, where you're sort of taking on risk or you're taking on credit in between that party. Then you could be opening yourself up for some sort of social engineering scale effect on your business, and that's something that you need to sort of think about and design for. It could also be that the technical solutions could actually be a hindrance to your business in some regards. So let's take another example. Let's say one of these massive systems. So what if something like a Reddit forum suddenly told everybody to move their money from one bank account to another, or said, hey, why doesn't everybody pay our electricity bill at the same time, or whatever, some sort of coordinated social engineering attack? Then your systems might technically scale, but if you've not got the business processes to handle that, then you could get yourself into a lot of problem actually, and you could find out that you never appropriately designed to defend that type of coordinated movement, and you could end up ruining your business. So again, it's something to really think about and test for business scaling. Are you designed for these large business social engineering events, and have you got the right KPIs and the right monitoring? In the same way as we put monitoring around our technical scaling and KPIs, X number of transactions per second, X number of failures per second, whatever, and alerting if a service is not available. Do we look at that from a business perspective? Here's my business services. Here's my business KPIs. Here's the amount of money in the bank. This is the amount of money coming down the bank account in a row. This is the amount of credit and risk that we've built up on an online retail base. And again, these are things to think about. And I think the world genuinely has changed there. And these business scaling and business monitoring and business transactions and thinking about things from a social engineering scale is something that we're going to have to start building into our architectures if we're not doing that already. Finally, I think there's a good news story, right? Which is at the end of this, wallstreetbets actually did a really nice thing and actually encouraged people to take some of their profits that they might have had from Gamestop and donate it to the Dian Fossey Gorilla Research Fund, which I think is kind of cool. And so they had their own sort of social event, social engineering scale challenge themselves, but it wasn't really a challenge. So over the course of a weekend, they would normally expect maybe sort of 10, 20 Gorilla subscriptions over that period of time. And in their case, they ended up with $237,000 over the course of a weekend, which is just incredible. But of course, weirdly enough, they had designed their system to handle that level of scale and their business to deal with that level of scale, and they got a nice little sort of windfall and could really help the gorillas there. So they obviously had thought about it, but again, that might be different for other people. But maybe the thing that they want to think about is what happens if all of those subscriptions cancelled at once. So it's maybe something that sort of black swan event is something that they want to think about in their consideration for next year, that they may not have that same event. So again, I don't know, but it's nice to see the gorillas got some extra money there. Anyway, I hope this has been useful for you. I hope you learned something, and I hope it's something that you sort of start to build into your own thinking. Thanks, and speak soon.